All right, it looks like people are still filtering in, but I will kick things off. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us here today for this webinar. I'm Ben Garfinkel, the director of the Center for the Governance of AI. We're a research and field building organization based in Oxford, UK, focusing on understanding and helping to address risks from advanced AI. I'm very excited for today's discussion with Paul Scharre on his latest book, For Battlegrounds: Power in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. Paul is the Executive Vice President and Director of Studies at the Center for New American Security. Paul's first book, Army of None, won the 2019 Colby Award and was named by The Economist as one of the top 5 books to understand modern warfare. His latest book, For Battlegrounds, came out early last year. It's a really valuable and I think also somewhat suspiciously well-timed resource for anyone who wants to understand the present moment in AI. It takes a look at the international struggle to control AI and the way the struggle has been playing out across 4 distinct battlegrounds, namely data, computing power, talent, and institutions. I'll also say that more generally, in my view, Paul was one of the first national security thinkers to really fully recognize and understand the potential importance of AI. I believe I first met him in 2017, shortly after I first entered the space myself. And since that time, he's absolutely been one of the thinkers whose views on these topics I give the most weight to and most respect. This event will be a fireside chat between Paul and Markus Anderljung, who is GovAI's head of policy. Markus has worked on a really diverse range of AI governance issues over the years, but has an especially deep expertise on AI regulation. And then beyond his work at GovAI, Markus is also a member of the OECD AI Policy Observatory's expert group on AI futures, as well as an adjunct fellow at the Center for New American Security with Paul. He also actually recently wrote a great foreign affairs essay with Paul entitled How to Prevent an AI Catastrophe that I recommend everyone who can get around the paywall should read. Markus and Paul will talk for a stretch of time. Then midway through, open up the conversation to questions from the audience. Please submit your questions in the Q&A box that you should see on the bottom of your screen. It's perfectly fine to submit these during the conversation and they'll be picked up afterwards. And you can also upvote questions that appear there that you'd especially like for Paul and Markus to discuss. Okay, so without further ado, let's jump in and I'll turn the seminar over to Markus to take us away.
Cool. Thank you so much, Ben. Yeah, Paul, really, really good to see you. I'm very excited about this conversation. Yeah, before we start, I guess I just want to congratulate you on the book. This guy right here. I read it last year. I thought it was very good. In particular, I think it does this really good job of straddling both the sort of AI world and the national security or sort of military world, while covering just like a huge swath of issues. And for the audience out there, for the purposes of this conversation, we won't do that much of sort of going over basics. We will assume that you know what AI is. We're not going to define it for you. We'll assume you've interacted with and you know what ChatGPT is, and so on. And yeah, let's sort of kick this off. Paul, could you just give us a brief sense of what's in the book?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Markus and Ben, for having me. Thanks everyone for joining this conversation, and thanks Ben for the very kind introduction and your words about the book to Markus. It's great to be here chatting with you all, and excited to have the chance to share some of these ideas with folks. The book came out about a year ago now, which as Ben pointed out turned out to be great timing in terms of sort of all of this wave of excitement about AI. The book looks at the geopolitics of artificial intelligence. So how is AI changing global power? And one of the frames that the book comes from is thinking about AI as, like another industrial revolution, like as a general purpose technology with a whole wide variety of different applications. And the book sort of asks, well, the industrial revolution transformed global power. So what might AI do? And in particular, we saw during the first and second industrial revolution that nations rose and fell on the global stage based on how rapidly they industrialized. We saw in particular in Europe that Great Britain and Germany raced ahead in terms of economic and military power because they industrialized faster, eclipsing Russia, who had started the 1800s as a larger economic and military power just by virtue of its larger size. And shifts also globally, right, on the global stage, certainly as Europe raced ahead in terms of industrialization compared to the rest of the world. But also we saw the key metrics of power change. So things like coal and steel production became key inputs of national power, oil, a geostrategic resource that countries, fight wars over. And so that's one of the things that the book looks at for AI is, well, what are these new metrics of power? It comes particularly from a Washington-centric national security lens. That's where I'm based out of, coming from the national security field. So the U.S. and China feature very heavily in the book as two global superpowers and certainly global leaders in the AI space. And then kind of looking at different dimensions of the AI competition and what are those key metrics going to be for power in an age of AI.
And yeah, what are those key metrics going to be?
Yeah. So I mean, the book concludes that there are these four key battlegrounds of competition: data, computing hardware, human talent, and institutions. The organizations are needed to take these raw inputs of data, computing hardware, and human talent and turn them into useful AI applications. And then the book sort of looks at, predominantly the US and China, although the book also takes some of the metrics that different groups have done, looking at the EU as well as a component of this, although in many of these, the EU is really in kind of third place behind the US and China, and analyzes how are each of them doing in these contests, and then also kind of what are the implications in terms of global power, in terms of a world that is led by the US or China in AI, in terms of things like domestic security and surveillance and human rights, or the competition in the military space. And how might that unfold? And then what are the consequences of AI integrating into the military?
Just out of interest, when people talk about sort of the inputs to AI, another input that people talk about is just algorithms and sort of the algorithms by which you end up training these systems, using them and whatnot. What's the reason that that's not one of your battlegrounds?
Yeah, so in terms of the technical inputs, right? So data, computing, hardware, and algorithms are these three inputs into machine learning systems. And I started by kind of looking at all three of these and saying, okay, well, what matters most from a global power standpoint? And the conclusion I came to was that ultimately, while algorithms are really vital for AI progress, in terms of geopolitical power, there's not a lot of advantage to be gained there because the technology proliferates so very rapidly.
Yep.
So the idea of having some critical algorithmic advantage over others seems unlikely, particularly given what we've seen so far, which so many breakthroughs in the AI field are published openly and shared very rapidly. And so new techniques can be proliferate very widely and then be used by others, that the idea of having some advantage there seems, I think, unlikely.
Yeah, makes sense. One thing that sort of Ben alluded to is, this is just an incredibly fast-moving space. I guess even if we just look at the last 3 months of 2023, we had the world's first global summit on the potential catastrophic risk from AI. We had, I think, maybe the longest executive order ever from the US government. We had the EU, teetering on the edge of regulating or not of sort of foundation models, CEOs of leading companies be ousted from boards, and all kinds of various things. And so, lots of things are happening in the space. Since the book was finished, I guess I'm curious sort of about how your views or how your sort of sense of AI has changed.
Yeah, I mean, it's head spinning, right? I don't know how you feel with all this progress happening, but it's remarkable just trying to stay on top of what's happening in the field. And even in the policy space, as you mentioned, some of these developments in the fall have started to happen very, very quickly. So the book was published in February of last year. Of course, that means because it has to go to print, the text was locked in the fall. And there were some, edits to current events throughout the fall, but a lot of the text was written even earlier. So I think one of the things that's, the whole wave of ChatGPT really came after the book had been kind of finalized. And so one of the things that's been changed, I think, in a big way, is just this degree of public awareness and interest, and then all of the policy activity over the last year, which, having been someone who worked on this for a while now, you could sort of feel that eventually these things were going to pick up steam and become more mainstream as the technology matures, and we have to face these things. When that was going to happen, when it was going to sort of kick off in this big way, and how that would unfold, I certainly didn't know. But it's been interesting, and I've been very encouraged by the degree of policy activity in Washington and other places in the EU and in the UK and elsewhere, even in China. I don't necessarily agree with a lot of things that they're doing inside China, but we see governments and other organizations really leaning into regulating AI and thinking through how we're going to use this technology to make sure that it's safe and beneficial for society. And I think that's important. Getting it right is going to be tricky, but having that conversation is the first step to make sure that we're saying, okay, we need to be thoughtful about how we use the technology.
And sort of when it comes to yourself, have you sort of changed your perspectives or how you're thinking about this technology since, I guess, one way to put it is sort of after the ChatGPT moment?
Well, I think GPT-4 to me was a big breakthrough that certainly changed a lot of how I was thinking about AI progress, mostly in the sense that I assumed that we would get to systems with GPT-4 level capabilities. I thought that we're probably another decade away. Like if you just sort of showed me the performance parameters of GPT-4 and said, when do you think we'll get here? I just said maybe like early 2030s. So I was quite surprised by that level of performance so quickly. I don't think like a lot of people in interacting with some of the more capable large language models that are out there, I mean, I'm quite impressed by a lot of what they can do already right now. And so I think like lots of folks, I've had to go through this mental process of being like, okay, well, there's a lot of things that I thought would happen eventually, but maybe a little bit further out, that's happening now. So then like, what is that? How do I readjust my expectations about progress? It may be that it'll be a blip up and then we'll see some slowing for some period of time. Or maybe my estimation about the rate of progress is off in a more fundamental way, that things are moving much faster. And, even the next 3 or 4 years are going to be perhaps more interesting. I don't know, but that's something I've certainly spent a lot of time wondering.
Yeah. I mean, at the very least, I think we should expect a big uptick in terms of investments into trying to make these systems do impressive things. I don't know what the numbers would be, but at least 1 or 2 orders of magnitude increased investments. I expect we'll see as a result of sort of more interest. Do you have a sense of sort of you've been paying more attention to this space than sort of others in sort of DC national security land? Do you have a sense of sort of how others' views have sort of changed or shifted?
Well, I think we've seen a couple shifts in Washington over the last year or so. One is, really part of a broader shift in Washington towards more hawkish positions on China, and that has a lot of implications for technology competition more broadly, and particularly for AI. That the sort of what had been a foreign policy consensus for several decades across multiple, Democratic and Republican administrations towards engaging China has completely pivoted in the last maybe 4 or 5 years towards now, really like sort of China is the only thing the Democrats and Republicans agree on in Washington. And everyone in Washington is a China hawk now. That's just kind of the reality. There's maybe degrees of hawkishness, but there's a consensus that's emerged that we are in a long-term strategic competition with China with multiple dimensions: political, economic, military. Technology is a big component of that. And the US needs to make some adjustments to its relationship with China as a result. Now, what comes next in that kind of context is a little bit unclear. You have some folks talking maybe on the extreme end about more aggressive decoupling from China. The sort of term of art that's more popular recently is de-risking. But I think at the end of the day, we're seeing across a whole wide range of areas a recalibration of the relationship between the US and China and AI and other things. So that's a big one. The other one has been just a huge amount of interest in AI over the last year. The voluntary agreements that the White House got with leading labs, and then the executive order, really impressive in terms of their feats, in terms of moving very, very quickly on these policy issues. I think the broader like debates in the field of AI about AI risk in particular, and there's these like really heated, emotionally charged, articles and statements that I'll read from people on Twitter or in articles on the web. Usually, I find in person maybe people are more nuanced and sophisticated, but that has not escaped Washington, right? And so you do get some flavor of that these debates about AI risk influencing how people in Washington are thinking. And I think I hear people on both sides of issues, people very worried about more extreme catastrophic risks from AI, also people who are dismissive of that. What's interesting to me is if you look at like the executive order, it really covers the gamut of things, anywhere from housing discrimination to things like the reporting threshold tied to compute requirements. And so, looking at what the executive order calls dual use foundation models, or what some people have called frontier models. And so one of the things that jumps out to me in that is that, in reality, we don't actually have to pick and choose where we pay attention in terms of policymaking. The government, believe it or not, has demonstrated it's capable of walking and chewing gum at the same time, which is great.
Yeah. I think another way to put it is just, I guess there are two dynamics here. One dynamic is just, well, if AI is going to continue to get more and more capable, people will see that. It's just going to be the case that every part of government is going to be affected somehow. And then I guess the other one is just this thing of sort of policymaking often it's sort of a in Swedish we have this expression of sort of the ketchup effect. So first there's nothing, you're trying to get the ketchup out, and then all of a sudden it all comes out. And so if it's the case of sort of making decisions, passing bills and whatnot, if that is just a really, really painful process that will take a lot of effort, what you'll do is you'll try to solve all the issues at once. And so the way that you can get to that decision is you bring in the whole coalition of everyone who's interested in doing something about X. And I think we're starting to see that in the AI space. And I expect that kind of dynamic will continue to be the case.
And you see that often in legislation, for example. There was this bandwagoning of like, okay, this bill's going through, and so everybody kind of starts hooking on all of their things. So in many ways, like some of this idea that different types of concerns about AI are sometimes at odds with each other doesn't like totally scan to me, in the sense that in many cases these are complementary concerns. You see this with the executive order of, okay, we're doing an executive order on AI, what goes in? And the answer is like a whole ton of different issues get included as part of that policy process.
Another thing that I'd be interested in getting your views on is just, how do you see sort of the risk landscape from these technologies, sort of broadly speaking?
I mean, I think one of the challenges is we don't really know. There is this time lag with AI systems, like any technology, of you've got on the one hand, like where's the future technological progress going? And nobody knows. I certainly don't know. I think all of the projections suggest that we will see significantly more capable AI systems. At least in the near term, there's not some hard limits in the near term on scaling up to larger systems. What they'll be able to do is very much an open question. But even setting aside future technological progress, we don't really have a good sense of what the risks are of today's state-of-the-art AI systems. Like, as they will proliferate, and they will over time, and get out into society and be misused by people, what will happen as a result, we don't yet know, in part because just evaluating the capabilities of systems today that exist is actually still a very difficult problem. But then we don't know how people are going to use it. This is something that in the security space, analysts struggle with. We've done a project years ago on drone proliferation. When we had a good sense of what the technology was, the question was just sort of, once everyone has drones, what does that mean? What are people going to do with drones? And we sort of knew the world would be different as we'd see more proliferated drones, but there were lots of debates at the time of what that would look like. And with AI, I think we're in the process of living through that. So if you look at disinformation, for example, GPT-2 came out in 2019, and you had people warning right when it came out that kind of text generator would make it easier for people to generate fake news, and that could spread disinformation. Now, I'll point out there were a lot of people that were very dismissive of that risk at the time. People saying, well, humans can write fake news and it's not very good, and this is all a bunch of hype, and this is silly. OpenAI was very heavily criticized for talking about the risks there. I think what we've seen in the 5 years since is, they're very valid. Now we live in this world where, that ability to use large language models is very widely proliferated. We're heading into an election season. We're already seeing deep fakes being used in different ways. Is it going to end truth as we know it? No, we've got a lot of problems already in the information landscape, but it's not making things easier. And so, we sort of had a little bit of warning time, but not a lot. And there's probably more we could have done with it in the interim. And now the problem is out there, and we got to manage that. And so to me, fast forward that to the future, what are the next threats that we can see some proof of concept of today, but maybe it's not widely proliferated yet? And how do we, maybe start to take those seriously and think about ways to respond as a result?
Yeah, what are some of those things on the horizon, and what kind of response are you expecting? Might make sense.
Yeah, I think two of the big ones that lots of folks are talking about the use of AI to enable more capable chemical and biological weapons, and AI and cyber risk, and the use of AI for various types of malicious cyber activity. I think both of those are very real. Now, how rapidly they mature and how rapidly they proliferate, they are very much unknown questions. But I think we would be foolish to dismiss out of hand those risks, because there are lots of properties of the AI systems that are likely to only get better over time in terms of their ability to learn from large amounts of data, process that data, synthesize it, build a model that has some understanding of either writing code or conducting scientific experiments, and then be used for people to accelerate those processes. Which on the coding side, for example, lots of people, lots of computer scientists are using AI already to help them write code. Lots of programmers are. People are going to use that for malicious software as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess another theme throughout the book is US-China competition. You and I have written about sort of potential sort of regulatory responses that might be needed to sort of address certain national security risks that might come from these systems as they become more capable. How are you thinking in terms of those kinds of regulatory responses potentially undermining the US's position vis-a-vis China?
Well, there's certainly a narrative that I often hear in Washington about this idea that regulation is in opposition to innovation. And in particular, when it comes to China, we should not overly regulate because we need to be ahead. I'll be honest, sometimes hear that a lot from tech companies. Which sort of thinks, maybe we should be pay attention to who's saying that message. I think I don't necessarily agree that these things are in opposition. I think that in a lot of ways, regulation can be not just helpful, but actually essential for adoption inside society. The only reason that we have clean air and water and safe food and safe medicine and safe air travel is because of government regulation. And if you look at commercial airlines, for example, if that wasn't safe, if we didn't have regulation, if airplanes were falling out of the sky left and right, I think people would be more reluctant to get on airplanes. I think that'd be a factor, right? So that's a place where actually I think that regulation can help an industry succeed by making sure that the technology is safe. And I think, in one particular instance, for example, I think there's some very important discussions underway about the open source community. How do we think about open source for the most capable AI models? The White House executive order kind of suggested it was taking a look. Suggested it was considering some kind of restrictions in this. It said very explicitly in executive order they were taking a look at models with widely available model weight, so i.e. open source models, and sort of teed up the pros and cons of this. I think sometimes it's characterized as like, if we were to restrict open source in some way, so if we were to say that like the most capable models that are very much dual use, that we know can be abused, and in and very easily the safeguards could be fine-tuned away very quickly.
Yep.
Oh, if we constrain that, that'll let us fall behind China. I think that's actually overly simplistic and probably wrong. Right now, by releasing those things open source, we are giving them to China. Like, so from a purely competitive standpoint, the place where the US has a major advantage right now is in the most advanced AI systems. We should want to protect that advantage. Now, that does, maybe intersect with the open source community in ways that might be more challenging for academia and startups if they don't have access to some of those systems. I think those trade-offs are very real, and we need to consider those. But the idea that the answer from a sort of China competition standpoint is don't regulate is, I think, overly simplistic, and in some areas certainly not true.
Yep. Yeah, another sort of topic in this sort of US-China competition bucket is, obviously there's been a lot of efforts from the US government to try to sort of constrain Chinese access to highly advanced AI chips, and I guess in particular starting with semiconductor manufacturing equipment. And yeah, I guess they were sort of expanded to sort of reducing access to sort of advanced chips last year, or in 2022, and then expanded to a greater portion of chips in last year in October. And initially, you sort of expressed a bit concern about these kinds of efforts. Could you give us a sense of sort of what those concerns were?
Sure. So I think, the perspective I'm coming from on this is I think we are in this long-term technology competition with China. I think we need to find ways to compete smartly. But in many ways, we're in this sort of like three-legged race where we are joined at the hip in a lot of aspects of our AI ecosystems with China. And so how do we find ways to recalibrate portions of that relationship in ways that more clearly benefit the United States? And I'm not in the camp of some in Washington where we need to cut off China from any US technology. I think there are some places where it benefits the United States, not for traditional reasons of engagement, because, if we work with China, then, they'll liberalize or they'll agree to something. I think we've seen that under Xi Jinping, the Chinese Communist Party is going in a particular, very authoritarian direction. They are really dead set on upending the regional order and making some very aggressive moves against, Taiwan and others in the region. I think we'd expect that's not going to change. But there still may be places where it benefits us to have some kind of relationship with China on AI, to be sharing technology. And in particular, I think there are some areas where it's going to be beneficial to the United States for China to depend on US technology, because that might mean that they rely on that. That gives us some leverage over their development of the technology that we want to, I think, sustain, in fact, rather than them being totally cut off and then maybe doubling down on indigenization. So I think on the particular measures that are in place now, the export controls on the manufacturing equipment to China make sense. I was very excited to see those when those came in last year. I was very concerned about the chip export controls when they first came out. It seemed to me too early to make that kind of move. That I think there's a lot of value in keeping China dependent on US technology, so they're not overly incentivized to indigenize, or the rest of the industry to get around US controls to adjust their supply chains. Now, I do think the developments we've seen since then, like GPT-4, have certainly changed, as I said earlier, like my calculus for where I think AI capabilities are going. That I think a lot of these things that might have been further off, my assessment would have been, I think, are not happening much sooner. But I still think, like, when you look at cloud controls, for example, as those are being debated right now by the US government, with some exceptions, like military use or training the most advanced models, I think there's benefit in the US allowing Chinese companies to use US cloud computing, because then it prevents them from turning elsewhere. And I think we should welcome that dependency on US technology.
Yep. Yeah. I guess since what is it? It's October 2022. We have the first chip export controls. Since then, yeah, we've had a number of developments. Yeah, we've had ChatGPT, and so maybe that means a sort of less of a reason to sort of keep your powder dry or something like this, or sort of yeah. I guess another sort of metaphor you can have is that people talk about sort of weaponized interdependence as sort of a reason that you want as sort of maybe your adversary to be dependent on your technology, but then maybe using that weapon blunts it. But yeah, maybe that means that's sort of one aspect here. I guess another aspect is we've sort of had time to see a bit of sort of the responses coming out, both from, I guess in my mind, the most important ones are both from the in China, but also from the sort of the chip companies, and in particular NVIDIA. So we saw NVIDIA produce chips that were sort of designed around the export controls that were then sort of shut down, or that loophole, whatever you might call it, was sort of shut down in sort of the update in October last year. And then on the Chinese front, I guess we've seen more moves towards, yeah, maybe using cloud, more moves towards sort of using sort of older generations or sort of less advanced, both SME equipment and also older chips. Taking all of that together, do you have a sense of how your takes on sort of chip controls in particular have sort of changed? Like, yeah, maybe another way to put it is sort of if you would you have preferred October last year that the controls would have been loosened rather than strengthened?
Well, I certainly, and when they came out, I thought that putting the chip controls in place was too strong.
Yeah.
Now, I think since then we've seen that they're not going away. I think AI progress is moving quite quickly,
Yeah.
and so I think I don't think it's changing. I guess I'm very much a realist about where what's possible in the policy space, and I think there's a case to be made that we're seeing the technology move forward fast enough now that restricting access for the most capable chips to China makes sense. I can get behind that. I still don't think that means that we need to try to cut off China from everything. If the answer is we can move some of that compute dependency to the cloud, and my colleague here at CNAS, Tim Fist, has done some really great work thinking about cloud computing. I think I've been convinced, in part because of some of the great work that Tim and his others have done, that that's a better place to think about regulating compute, that we can keep the chips themselves here in the United States, and then have others accessing that compute through the cloud. But I think if it's for like Chinese commercial use, I think that's fine. I actually think we should encourage it. I would much prefer that, as long as it's not for human rights abuses or military use or training the most capable models, that Chinese companies are turning to US cloud providers and depending on them for compute. I think that's a better place to be.
Yeah. The big challenge to me seems to be sort of, what do you do about cloud that's sort of not US based? So I expect we'll see. We've seen, I think it's specifically to Singapore, we've seen really big orders from NVIDIA, and you can imagine sort of the reasons for that. And so the other challenge might be, if you want to use this sort of cloud node, how could that node be used if those data centers are based outside of the US, which you could imagine that you'll see some incentives towards where you want your data centers to be closer, so you have lower latency and those kinds of things.
That's right. And so actually, Tim and Ani Arn have done a great report that just came out recently, looking at chip hardware security mechanisms as a possible technical solution to this very problem of, okay, so if you have data centers outside the United States and you would like to have some control over how compute is used there, how do you do that? And one mechanism could be more security mechanisms on chips themselves that could allow you to, for example, verify that there aren't training runs above some certain scale that are being used, or maybe even some particularly concerning data sets, maybe about biological data, for example, that might be tied to potential use of biological weapons, some dual use data sets. There might be some technical solutions there. I think that's the kind of thing that we need to be thinking about. But I think one of the things that's challenging here is this is a very dynamic environment, right? So the US government takes some action. No one else is going to sit back at the sidelines, right? You walk through China, Singapore, private companies like NVIDIA and others are also going to take steps in response to that. We want to start thinking about then what are the effects of U.S. policy actions, including things that maybe we are not what we want to see. I think we want to start getting towards how do we move towards a global compute architecture that is secure, where for accessing large amounts of computing hardware, that we have some sense of where these chips are going, who's using them, what they're being used for. That might look differently in different countries based on where the chips are going to, but how do we start to put in place the building blocks today of that kind of governance architecture for hardware?
Yeah, to at the very least be able to do that for sort of the really, really big sort of compute uses.
Exactly.
Yeah, the kinds of things that cost tens or hundreds of millions of dollars to put together. Great. Yeah, I guess another thing that I'd be interested in getting your takes on, but maybe this is something where you don't feel you have expertise, is the question of sort of how U.S.-China relations will change as a result of sort of the economic downturn that we've been seeing in China. Is that, yeah, to what extent have you seen that sort of change? I guess to some extent maybe we've seen that change sort of Chinese behavior. Do you expect that we'll see sort of a change in sort of how people think about these issues in Washington?
Well, I think we've seen a somewhat softer tone from Beijing. When
Yep.
COVID hit, there was just this very, very strong political response from Beijing of telling people to put on a mask and shut up, and this kind of mass diplomacy, and this coupled with broader, more aggressive military action against Taiwan, sparking a border crisis and some clashes with India. We sort of saw more broadly this this perception, I think, within the leadership in Beijing that the old time of biding your time was over, and now it was China's moment, and the West was in decline, and China was on the ascendant. And I think we have seen quite clearly the economic downturn in China has led to China being more willing, the leadership, to engage with the United States, to at least say, how do we stop the downward spiral, right? How do we stop the next tranche of export controls that are coming out of the U.S. government, which is very much on the minds of leaders in Beijing. Publicly, they put on a strong face, but certainly in a lot of private messaging, it's clear that that is having an effect, and they're very eager to see some of those controls lessened. But I don't think we're seeing a fundamental shift in Chinese leadership. We still see internally Xi consolidating power. We've seen that he's continued to actually go through purges among the PLA, consolidate power among the senior leadership in the Chinese Communist Party. And so I think this is more of a shift in tone than some fundamental change in U.S.-China relations, which I think is going to be rocky for some time.
Yeah, yeah. And do you expect it will change sort of how U.S. policymakers are sort of thinking about these issues, that sort of maybe you pay less attention to the competition or something like this, as you might think that sort of you're less likely to, or maybe the sort of the point at which you have sort of Chinese ascendancy sort of is pushed out?
I don't think that we'll see a major shift in the views on China here in Washington. I think there's been a consolidation of this acknowledgement that we're in this competition with China, and we need to energize the United States to compete effectively with them. Now, the U.S. has been for the last several years saying we want to look for areas of cooperation with China in the midst of this competition. So sure, we're going to compete with you on economic issues and military and political issues, but on things like climate change. We all live on this planet together. We need to find a way to address this collectively. And the U.S. and China, as the big heavyweights here, need to be working together on climate change, for example. Or certainly during the pandemic, the U.S. was interested in trying to work more constructively with China on a lot of these global health issues. It was, in fact, China that has really been reluctant to engage the U.S. on those things and has tried to condition cooperation in areas of mutual concern, like climate change, on the U.S. changing its stance on unrelated issues like Taiwan, for example. And so I think now that there's a little bit more willingness out of Beijing to actually work with the United States, I think there's receptivity in Washington to, okay, look, let's acknowledge the broader geopolitical reality that we see a lot of things differently, but where are some areas of potentially mutual agreement? And AI is on that list, where there's obviously a lot of places where we have shared risks. And coming out of the Biden-Xi meeting, there's some agreement to talk about AI. I think we'll see where that goes, but that could be hopefully encouraging.
Yep. Interesting. Yeah, another sort of set of topics where I'd like to get your views is sort of more in the direction of sort of how AI will be used sort of in the military and sort of how it might change sort of what happens on the literal battlefield. And so I expect one high-level question that sort of our audience would be interested in is something like, how do you expect AI technologies to have an impact on the battlefield over the next, say, 5 years? What are the kinds of technologies that you expect to sort of have the biggest impact?
Well, I think in the next 5 years, it'll be minimal. I think in the long run, the effect on warfare from AI is likely to be very transformative, probably on the same scale as the way that we saw the Industrial Revolution transform warfare in terms of the sort of scale of destructiveness that was possible. And I think AI is likely to do something similar, maybe not with the physical attributes of warfare, but cognitive attributes like information processing and decision making and speed of action on the battlefield. But I think, one of the things that people who maybe don't follow the defense space closely may not appreciate is the time lag for militaries between what's happening out in the commercial sector and then what militaries are doing. It's just massive. It's mind-blowing to me sometimes. And so it's not like just the United States, it's really all militaries are way behind the commercial sector on AI and even other related technologies like cloud or just, amassing and using large data sets, for example. And technology is not coming out of the commercial sector, out of the military space. It's coming out of the commercial sector. And there's this like multi-stage process for militaries to take use of it. First, they have to understand that it's important. Having been someone in Washington who's been jumping up and down saying like AI is the thing that's happening, you need to be paying attention for several years now. That is a challenge in the first place. That a lot of times people don't, there's a real time lag for them to even appreciate things that out in Silicon Valley or some other places in the tech world people understand are important. And then they've got to figure out what to do with it. They got to do some studies, put the contracting vehicles in place. That's an absolute nightmare. Write what the military calls requirements, which is sort of documents about what they're looking for, and then find ways to use it effectively. And even for Project Maven, the DoD's flagship AI project that's now 6 years old, started back in 2017, to use AI for image classifiers. So as this goes, relatively mature AI technology. When I talk to experts in the intel analysis field where it's used, what I'll often hear is, look, technically very impressive, does some neat stuff, but has it transformed intelligence analysis in some fundamental way? Not yet. And we know for lots of technologies that process of now you have to actually change your business processes to harness the technology takes a long time. So I think it's going to be a lengthy process, and I think the military is going to significantly lag the private sector.
Yeah, interesting. You said, maybe I misheard you. You said something that sounded like you thought that sort of the I guess one way to put it is sort of the kinetic technologies would matter, would sort of be less important than sort of more the sort of back office applications or sort of using. I assume the kind of thing you have in mind is sort of using ChatGPT or other systems to sort of help with decision making and analyzing data, those kinds of issues, rather than sort of having lethal autonomous weapons out in the field. Could you expand upon that a bit?
Yeah. So first of all, I think that we're on a track to see certainly AI used in battlefield applications. We see drones used heavily in Ukraine. We see image classifiers used in some of those drones. I don't think it's a large proportion of them, but as near as we can tell, there are some isolated examples. There at least was one claim by a Ukrainian company in the fall of last year that they had a fully autonomous weapon that had been deployed and had been used in attacks in Ukraine. Now, I've not seen independent verification of that, but I would not be surprised if we do see autonomous weapons used in Ukraine or elsewhere in the relatively near term, because that technology is very doable. With that acknowledged, I think the more transformative applications to warfare will be in support functions. There'll be more back office things. That's not to say that the battlefield stuff won't happen, and it raises really important legal and ethical and moral questions that we need to wrestle with. But most of what militaries do is in the support functions. It's logistics, maintenance, readiness, personnel management. We've seen actually in Ukraine that stuff's vitally important. If you can't do that, and Russia has demonstrated, just a terrible ability to be able to support its forces, to do maintenance, to do logistics, for example, then it has a very deleterious effect on the battlefield.
Yep.
And so I think that's actually probably, certainly in the near term, and maybe even in the long run, where some of the more impactful AI applications are going to be. I mean, a lot of what the military does on a day-to-day basis looks a lot like what Walmart or Amazon do. It's moving people and things from point A to point B. Now, what happens at the end is different, but AI being used to support those back office functions, if you can make all of those things 5% better, that is a huge effect in the long run.
Yep. Great. I have many more questions, but we also have questions from the audience, and so we're gonna move on to those. And yeah, the first question is from someone who remains anonymous. Although your focus is on the US, I imagine you follow conversations in the UK and Europe as well. What do you see as the biggest differences between how US and other Western countries are approaching AI policy?
Yeah, well, we certainly see, I think, three somewhat distinct models evolving between the US and UK and EU. The US having a much more laissez-faire approach to regulation. For example, the EU, of course, leaning fairly aggressively into regulation with the EU AI Act. And there's just a lot of, I don't hear a lot of enthusiasm from Washington for the EU approach, concerned that it's too broad brush, that it's likely to constrain innovation, that it'll cut off valuable applications. So that's, I think, a huge difference between the US and the EU approach. One of the things that's striking out of the conversations that at least I'm hearing sort of on this side of the Atlantic and what's coming from the UK is a lot of concern out of the UK about frontier models and catastrophic risk and existential risk and things that are viewed much more skeptically in Washington. That I hear some of those concerns in Washington, but I'd say maybe 9 out of 10 times if I hear someone raise existential risk in Washington, it's in a derisive manner saying, this is silly, why are people talking about this? This is a bunch of nonsense. It seems like, at least from where I sit, that the conversations are a little bit different in the UK. Now, I'm not there, so maybe that perception is not true, but it seems like there's just more receptivity in the dialogues going on underway in the UK towards more extreme AI risk, which seems like an important distinction.
Yep. Yeah, another question from Harry Papagiorgio, who asks, I guess the gist of the question is sort of, how are you expecting, or sort of what do you think have been and sort of will continue to be the effects of controls on semiconductor manufacturing equipment? Harry specifically asked about ASML's lithography machines, but yeah, maybe we can focus on that particular question.
Well, I mean, I guess a couple significant things. I mean, I think the U.S. expansion back in October of 2022 was very significant, and in particular, the policy shift from the U.S. government and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan kind of gave a speech on this, outlining that the old policy of keeping China 2 generations behind was gone, and the goal was now as widely as possible. I think that's great. I think that makes all the sense in the world. You still need to figure out where are places where some kind of export controls are defensible. Because if you put them in place and it's not going to be sustainable, then that's maybe harming the U.S. in the long run. I think getting Japan and the Netherlands on board was absolutely critical to make these effective. My sense is that they've come along reluctantly, and there may be still some daylight between where the U.S. is or would like to go on manufacturing equipment and tooling, and where the Japanese and Dutch governments are, but they have come on board to some extent. So this is a place where like a lot of the devil's going to be in the details of like, okay, what specific pieces of equipment or tooling can we restrict, or chemicals or other things that we think are going to be effective that there aren't other suppliers to replace. The other big open question is going to be, what is China able to do? And we don't know. There was, the chip that had come out last year that I think shocked a lot of people about how far China was able to go But I think, what they're able to do with existing equipment on hand with their DUV machines, and like, is that going to be cost effective for China to scale that production up is very much an open question. And, if they're able to do that effectively, that's significant. I think the other wrinkle here is going to be like, what's the cost penalty to China for competing with frontier models? And how expensive do these frontier models get? So if the cost, penalty is like a 2x penalty in cost because they're using maybe slightly older chips, and the chips are maybe even a little bit more costly for them to produce, for example, if they're doing it indigenously, and the cost of the models themselves are not that high, China might be willing to pay that, and there may not be much of a gap between the US and China in terms of the most advanced AI systems. Now, conversely, if the cost penalty starts to widen a little bit, and the cost of the models themselves are much higher, we get to like $10 billion models, and you've got even a 5x cost penalty, now that's real money you've got to throw out to train these models. And then you maybe start to see a much wider gap between the most capable models out of, say, US labs and then where the Chinese models are. But again, if it's all open source, if we see companies in the US release these models open source, then that gap disappears pretty quickly.
Yeah. I think it's a tricky question, especially this sort of how much does the multiplier matter? If you have some kind of view that sort of the thing that you need to do is you need to build up a whole ecosystem of expertise and you need to build up a whole industry, then maybe the multiplier really does. Even smaller multipliers might really matter because it might sort of reduce investment. At the very least, you're going to need to put in not just money on sort of developing the model, but maybe you're going to need to put in money further down in the supply chain as well. So I think that'll be really important question going forward. And yeah,
maybe
I guess
just one additional point on that. Like I'm inclined to think that policy actions that increase cost to China to compete in the most advanced AI systems and or introduce delays to them are beneficial, and depending on what the sort of negative consequences are probably beneficial to the US in the long run. It's like sometimes I'll hear from people like, well, these export controls, it's and for example, something like export controls on trained models themselves. Well, these things will proliferate eventually, so why bother? And if you can introduce, I mean, we talked about this in the foreign affairs article we wrote together. If you can introduce a delay to something that will proliferate eventually, but give more time for mitigation measures, for to build even more capable systems that might be used as defensive ones in response, that time delay could be incredibly valuable.
Another one of these of sort of maybe you have takes on this, in which case I would find them interesting type question. From ASML, if I remember correctly, I think they're either it's sort of the biggest growth they've seen in sales, or maybe it's just even where they've seen the most sales over last year has been to China, but selling DUV machine rather than EUV machines, the extreme ultraviolet machines. Yeah, do you have a sense of what that should tell us, or what that tells us about where things are going in terms of Chinese sort of indigenization of the semiconductor industry?
So China's been a major source of growth in semiconductor manufacturing for some time. They've been the largest kind of growing market in this space because of a lot of investment by the Chinese government. It's been a big focus of theirs to try to increase indigenous chip manufacturing capacity. They've been behind, of course, but they've been working on catching up. And it's not a surprise. And my understanding from experts in the industry was for several years, Chinese investment has been sort of above what would be needed for the market, right? Because they're doing this really from like a geopolitical standpoint. They're making this investment in the technology. So it's not surprising that they're going to continue to make these investments, buying DUV machines, buying whatever is accessible to them. I think that's where kind of these conversations between the United States and the Netherlands and Japan about where we can draw that cut line in terms of the export controls that's sustainable is really important. And if there's other things that we can and maybe should be cutting off to China, that's probably a smart move. But I think, we don't know. Like, it's very hard to know how cost effective China's going to be able to do with their indigenous capacity. And in some extent, we won't know until they've done it, at which point it's too late.
Yeah. And even, I mean, even then, I mean, yeah, we've seen previously you referenced the Huawei 7 nanometer chip, and we've seen it, but we don't know what the cost was, and so we don't know whether to be worried about it or not. I guess, yeah, we're sort of running up on time. We have one last question that I'll do that I feel like was a good point to end on, which comes from also an anonymous person. The question is, the policy conversation around AI has moved dramatically over the past year. Do you have any predictions about how it might move over the next year?
I suspect we will hear lots of chattering about an AI winter. And I don't understand why, but it seems like no matter how much progress we've seen in AI over the last decade plus, there's this perpetual obsession that people have of it's all petering out and it's hitting a wall and we're going to hit an AI winter and it's all made up. And I mean, I have some guesses. I think a lot of it is that there's a lot of people that have a certain preconceived idea about what AI should look like based on what they think intelligence is. And when the investments we're seeing in AI are not building that, they find it offensive and they don't agree, right? So I think my prediction is we'll see a lot of that. We may even see a lull in breakthroughs for some period of time. We saw a little bit after Gemini Ultra was released, which performance is it's not a step function increase beyond GPT-4. And immediately I saw the news reactions of like, oh well, see, the era of large models is over, and et cetera, et cetera. I think none of that's actually true, and we're not seeing any limits in the near term towards continued scaling. But I think we'll hear a lot of that from people. I think the really interesting open question, one interesting one to me, will be surrounding this compute regulatory threshold that the executive order sets. How do we see companies respond to that? Because they have some choices here, right? Like they could choose to presumably lean into that in the sense that they could declare a training one early on and say, we're going to do this. And there might be reasons why some companies want to be the first to say we're going to cross this threshold. We could also see companies choose to train things right up to that point and not cross it for as long as they can. And I think that'll depend on some of the idiosyncrasies of how companies are thinking about their strategies. But then that, how does that, from a regulatory standpoint, how do companies react to that? What does the government do? Right now, there's no government standards about what to do in terms of safety testing when you get there. NIST is working on developing that. I think that's like a really interesting policy space we'll have to see how that shakes out, because it could be very consequential in terms of setting some actually regulations in place about safety for the more capable systems. Of course, the executive order says nothing about what happens if a company tests a model and it doesn't meet the government safety standards. Right? There's no actually restrictions in place. It's just a reporting requirement.
It just let us know.
That whole space is very interesting.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, that sounds very interesting. I'm sure we'll have an interesting year ahead of us. Yeah, thank you very much, Paul, for taking the time to talk to us. Thank you, everyone in the audience, for taking the time to listen and to engage with these questions. Thank you also, Ben, for the introduction. We will edit this video and plan to put it up on our YouTube channel in case there was something that you felt like you missed or you want to go back to. And yeah, other than that, thank you all very much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Paul. Bye.